This is a disagree question, so we're looking for an answer choice that one of these speakers would say yes to and that the other would say no to. As I read Antonio, I'm going to pay attention to everything, but as I read Marla, I'm only going to pay attention to things that Antonio also addresses. They need to both address it in order to have a disagreement about it. So Antonio says you can have a life of moderation by never deviating from the middle course, but then you're going to miss out on some stuff. You lose the joy of spontaneity that those who are occasionally willing to take great chances get. You miss out on these opportunities. So if you never deviate from the middle course, you can have a life of moderation, but you're going to be missing out to some degree. That's Antonio's position. Marla says, in the interest of moderation, if you never risk going too far, you're actually failing to live a life of moderation. So she's talking about if you never deviate from the middle course, you're actually not being moderate, because you have to be moderate even in your moderation. Now, this second part, Antonio doesn't address. So I'm going to focus on the first part. She says if you never deviate from the middle, you can't live a life of moderation, because this is not moderation. Moderation would be going against this sometimes. So the question that they would disagree about is, can you live a life of moderation if you never deviate from the middle course? Antonio would say yes, and Marla would say no. Let's go ahead and check out the answers. Answer choice A attaches more strongly to Antonio's argument. He talks about the joy of spontaneity and missing out on opportunities that come from taking great chances. And so Antonio would probably say that it's desirable, although he doesn't talk about it on balance. Just because you see the upside to something doesn't necessarily mean you think it's desirable. It could have significant downside. But more importantly, Marla doesn't say no to it. So the problem with A is you don't really have any opinion from Marla, and that's our way out of it. Now, B says, what a life of moderation requires from a person. And Marla would say, you have to be moderate even in your moderation. You have to deviate sometimes in order to have a life of moderation. She thinks you need to deviate sometimes, whereas Antonio says you can never deviate, or you can have a life of moderation by never deviating. So according to Antonio, you don't need to deviate from the middle course in order to live a life of moderation. So as far as what it requires, Marla says you have to deviate sometimes, but Antonio would say that you don't. And so they do disagree about these requirements. Marla thinks that this is a requirement, and Antonio thinks that it's not. And so I'm actually going to get into this one. I'm going to erase the red, and I'm going to hit it with blue, because I think this is the right answer choice. Whether it's possible, now this is really weak, it's going to be hard to say no to. Whether it's possible for a person to embrace other virtues along with moderation, yeah, no one's going to say that it's not. It's going to be hard to find a no for answer choice C. Remember, our preference here is an answer choice that's kind of in the middle. If it's really weak, it's hard to say no to. If it's really strong, it's hard to say yes to. And we need to get a yes and a no in order to like the answer choice. How often a person ought to deviate from the middle course? Nobody really gets specific on it. So we don't know how often, and we don't know that they disagree about how often one ought to. Antonio's not saying you should live a life of moderation, and so he's not saying you should never deviate from the middle course. It's this ought that nobody really weighs in on here. We're not going to be able to get a yes or a no on D. And whether it's desirable, see again, like A, nobody really talks about what's desirable. They're just talking about what's possible. Whether it's possible to live a life of moderation and never deviate from the middle course. Antonio thinks that it is. Marla thinks that it's not. She thinks if you never deviate, that that's not a life of moderation. And so they disagree about the requirements, but nothing else here is the source of disagreement.